Hello, welcome to Deeper Than Dogma. So for tonight's discussion, the title of this video was What Would God Need with a Starship? For anyone that doesn't get the reference, it comes from Star Trek V, one of the movies, that when Kirk and his crew meet a being that identifies itself as God, this God shows interest in acquiring Captain Kirk's starship. Now, this sets off alarm bells for Kirk that what would an all-knowing, all-powerful being need with a starship? Now, I mean, that's just Star Trek, and I think most people would be in agreement with that. Doubting this being was probably a good call on his part. But if we were to extrapolate on this further, what would an omnipotent, omniscient being need with anything? When a being is described with such perfection, wouldn't that mean that they are complete? Why would they need or want anything? And what would, if it was the creator of the universe, what would it actually demand, or why would it demand things from his creation? So tonight on the panel, we got Adam Pugh, Floyd FP, Ozymandias Ramses, Sheamus, Xbox, and myself, Sock Account. And I guess to start off, I want to correct Ozzy that it was Captain Kirk first. It was Spock that asked it afterwards. But
Yeah.
I rewatched the clip a couple times just because I was trying to figure out where I'd seen it. I knew it was one of the movies, but I just had to confirm it, or else I'd get a bunch of Trekkies completely pissed off at me, and then they'd boycott my show, and that'd be terrible. But so to start off with this idea of a perfect being that needs stuff, that demands stuff. Why is this something that is required? Why would a perfect being actually need anything? In the case of the Christian God, for example, one of the ways to salvation is to believe in Jesus' resurrection, and that can almost guarantee you a spot in some type of eternal paradise. But what does God gain from having us believe? And on the other end, what does he gain from making those that don't believe suffer? So I guess to start off, I mean, I'll throw it to any one of the theists that want to jump in and start off at that point there.
Or we can even switch it up to what do we gain by the same token, besides the eternal paradise or whatever, but what do we actually gain?
Could I take a whack at that question?
Absolutely.
It seems to me that from the view that I would hold, the theological position that I would take is not that the God who's described in the Christian scriptures needs to create things that are not himself. It's not that he's contingent upon them to fulfill his desires, but rather that he chooses to create it without any kind of reason outside him dictating that he do so.
But again, you bring up an interesting thing where you refer to God's desires. What would a perfect being actually desire from his creation? I mean, and if he did desire anything from it, why couldn't an all-powerful being just make it so?
Well, my position would be that he has that the world as it is as a whole, meaning all of history, everything in time and space, is the perfect world because it is the world that God has chosen.
All right, anybody else want to jump in on that? Adam, Sheamus, or any of the non-theists?
Yeah, I mean, so on the question of why would God do things this way and not some other way, recognize that at least theoretically God can do things any way he wants, but if he does it differently, then it's different. And I know that may sound a little bit tautological, but let me explain what I mean. It is different to have a being that you make to love you, that has no choice but to love you. That is different from making a being that has a free choice to love you and makes that choice. Those are different beings. And one of the things I would say that likely it is that it is nonsensical to say God could do is to make a being that that has no choice but to choose to love him. Right? I would say that's contradictory. That doesn't make sense. So if in fact what God wants, and I have to say want, because let me note from Acts chapter 17, God does not need anything. Okay, it says God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. Okay, so God provides everything. He doesn't need anything. But it does. The Bible does indicate that God wants things, and generally, what God wants are things that, by definition, by the very definition of what they are, he in fact could not get them for himself. Okay, which is to say, a free choice to love God. By definition, anything God did that would guarantee him that would not be that. Am I making sense?
Wouldn't just on that just the law of just numbers, that throw enough humans out there with free will that it guarantees him some will?
Yeah, maybe, but the Bible indicates there are other conditions for the reality we're living in, right? Namely, that every human gets a fair shake, that justice will be done for every human, and various other conditions, which it's not obvious to me then that any number of humans in any situation would necessarily meet the promises God has set out for our humans on this world, if that makes sense.
Could I offer an alternative interpretation of Christian theology?
Sure.
So I would agree with Adam that that we both agree that God does not need anything outside of himself. He exists a se. He is eternal and self-existent, and he doesn't depend on anything else. He's not contingent. All of these are just synonyms for the same kind of point of view, to say, if you're saying God depends on something else or needs something else, then it would be wrong. Psalm 50 verse 9 says, I have no need of a bull from your stall or of goats from your pens. Verse 12 says, if I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all that is in it. And this is pointing to God's not needing anything. But I think I would say then that from that it seems very clear that then God is not defined by some abstract concept of possibility outside himself, which would say something like, God cannot gain love unless he puts himself at the mercy of some kind of choices from beyond himself. Rather, God is love in and of himself, and he defines what the word possibility even means. In fact, I don't think God even, from God's perspective, I don't think there even is possibility. I think he can only view things from actuality, because to God there is only himself and what he has chosen to exist beside himself. But I would say that if the question, because I didn't take the question this way, but Adam did, but if the question is, could God have done other than what he did, I would say no, he could not have. He has the power to do so, but he does not have the desire to do so, and he cannot contradict his desires.
Now, again, sorry, this is, and the word desire came up again, is that, and this might be one of the problems that I'm coming to in this, is that if a being is, by definition, perfect, now I know that maybe it's just hard for us to, understand this, or the desire to anthropomorphize the characteristics of him by saying desire there, but it comes back to the main point is what is desire to something that is already perfect? What does that even mean?
Well, I have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. The question that comes to my mind in connection with the idea of a perfect being that is defined as being omniscient and omnipotent and omnibenevolent is, for what purpose, for what function does it have desires? I mean, we all have desires, right? Organisms have desires, right? We have a desire to be safe, we have a desire to be healthy, a desire to be fed, a desire to be sheltered, a desire to be uninjured, and then we have all kinds of other little desires along the way that feed into those desires. But ultimately, our desires issue forth from needs that we have. We have needs. We have nutritional and alimentary needs, and we have needs to maintain our body temperature and things like that. There's all kinds of simple biological imperatives that act upon us, and our wants, the things that we desire, the things that we favor and prefer and want to realize and bring about, arise because they allow us to act in ways that will secure our needs. But if a being enjoys complete aseity, that is, it's a completely self-existing thing, it's not contingent upon anything else, it exists necessarily in all of its attributes, then that being, of course, has no needs. There's literally nothing that can threaten its existence or threaten any of its attributes, especially if you posit that it's unchanging. Then I don't see that it could have needs. And if it doesn't have needs, I don't know why it would have desires. So I think that our concept of desire is sort of to be understood as part of a psychological package that includes needs. You can sort of look at organisms, including ourselves, and say, well, I understand why organisms have wants, why they have desires. This is all about preferences, and preferences are important. It's important that an organism have an index of priorities, that it prioritize one thing over another, that it prioritize, that it put food in its mouth and not stones in its mouth or something like that. That it mate when there's someone of the opposite sex there for reproductive purposes. That it flee when it's in danger, and that it pursue prey when there's actually prey that's there to be pursued and such. So it seems to me that the whole concept of desire rests on logically prior, a concept of needs to serve, and I don't know how we disentangle those. Right. It's hard for me to fathom a being that actually has desires that are not completely arbitrary in the absence of needs.
No, I think
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, I think that brings out the obvious question of, is when the Christians hear anybody talking that, when they say desires, are they meaning the same thing that you just explained?
Yeah, maybe we should talk about that as well. What constitutes a desire?
Can I respond to what Ozzy just said?
Please.
Well, kind of, Ozzy seemed to post that desires were basically based off of needs. But I could also posit a situation where things that I desire, other people desire, aren't necessarily based on things we need, but more wants. I'm not necessarily trying to draw an analogy to God, more so I'm trying to dispute the absolute nature that desires are based on needs. So when we think of needs, we think of, food and, or these, necessities. But desires are based not only on necessity, but they're based on things that we want. For example, people desire money, okay? But in a sense, you do need money, okay? But think about this. People desire Ferraris. Well, some people could say, well, you do, need a car. Well, you don't technically need a car. Well, let's think of an example that something you really couldn't justify having. Some people desire famous art. They have a taste and a desire for really, really expensive, famous art, whether it's as a status symbol or whatever it is. No, these things aren't necessarily needs, and they don't involve anything that sustains us. So I wouldn't necessarily make the argument that desires are based solely on needs. They can be based on things we merely just want. that aren't necessarily justified out of necessity.
But so
that wouldn't be my position, though. If I could just push back on that, my position isn't that we only want what we need, but that the reason we have wants in the first instance is to satisfy needs, and that any wants that we have that seem not directly tied to needs are in fact indirectly tied to needs. So, for instance, someone wants a Ferrari. Why do they want a Ferrari? Well, it's because they crave status. Why do they crave status? Right? Well, it's because we innately have a need to be esteemed by people and admired and respected by people. So I think that even things that seem completely frivolous as desires and wants are ultimately traceable to needs. It's just that we can be mistaken about the things that we want and how well they satisfy our needs. I mean, a person can want something that in fact doesn't satisfy their needs, but they think that they do.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I think you can see a disconnect there, that I think ultimately there isn't one.
Yeah, I think I do in fact agree with Sheamus and disagree with Ozzy on this. In that, while I understand that what Ozzy is saying is that on some level, at least, on a first order, our wants tend to correlate with our needs. But I agree with Sheamus that we can have needs and preferences what I would say is this: needs are what needs are really related to are goals. Okay, or not needs. I'm sorry. What our wants are really related to are our goals. Okay, so we have an objective. We have something we want to accomplish, or that something out there that we decide is something to accomplish, and our wants are part of that. But those goals aren't just survival. Right, aren't just necessity.
Right.
The goals can be frivolous. They can go well beyond that, and because of that, I don't think there's anything unreasonable about even a being that doesn't have the needs we have, still nonetheless having preferences and goals.
But why does it have any preferences at all? Like what? It seems to me there we run the risk of having preferences that are completely arbitrary because they're not tied to goals and they're not tied to needs. So
why would a preference be arbitrary if it's not? Well, first of all, our needs are arbitrary.
No, needs are caused. I would argue that the needs that sentient beings, of which we know exist, such as ourselves and other critters, that the kinds of needs that they have are contingent consequences of evolutionary biology. So that would be my view. That's in other words, there's an explanation. There's not a reason why we have the needs that we do, but there are causal explanations. There are causes for why we have the needs that we do, and that determines our goals, and that determines our wants and our desires. But in the case of a perfect being, of course, has no needs. Actually, are we all agreed on that? Maybe we're not. Are we agreed that a deity, a perfect being, would have no needs?
Right.
Maybe it does. I mean, maybe we're assuming too much here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Would you, if you were fulfilled, if you were completely fulfilled in every way, what would it mean to have a need at that point?
Yeah. Well, is that part of the idea of perfection, that you have no needs, that you are fulfilled in every respect? Maybe not.
Right.
Floyd, you wanted to throw in a comment there.
Yeah. I heard the suggestion that the reason why humans worship God is just out of the need for God. Like it's a desire, just like any other human desire. Think of something like heliotropism, where a plant or a flower turns its leaves towards the sun, to get I guess nutrients, or for photosynthesis, for example. So it's analogous to that humans were designed to worship that. Now it just begs the question, though, why would God design us in such a way? Perhaps we can say, well, that's just the way it is, but that's one way I heard it explained to me before.
Jimmy, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, if I could say, I would place our epistemology on these things on the revelation of the Bible. And I know probably most people won't agree with me in terms of that actually being a cogent epistemology, but for the sake of talking about hypotheticals, I don't think you're going to find as sophisticated a monotheism as is revealed in the Christian scriptures. And I think the way the Christian scriptures go about revealing God is through his divine names. Perhaps the foremost of this is Exodus 3:15, when God reveals himself as the I Am, the being who is revealed in the form of fire that does not depend on the bush which is burning. So I think, yes, I think it's very clear that, at least from the biblical perspective, to be a perfect being, to be God, is to be a being who does not rely on anything else, not only for his being, but God actually doesn't need any reality beyond himself to even categorize himself as God or to distinguish himself as God. God is the referent to his own category, just as he is the category of that referent, which is unlike any other being in reality. But in answering the question about arbitrariness, I don't see that as an issue. Arbitrariness is a problem, I think, when we are holding to some kind of principle of sufficient reason, which I would, and we have somebody doing something for no reason. God cannot do things for no reason, and this is due to two answers. Number one, the God of the Bible is divinely simple. Christianity is held for hundreds of years, at least Orthodox Protestant Christianity, that God cannot be divided into parts, nor is he composed of certain things in and of themselves. Rather, whenever you're talking about the goodness of God, you are referencing the being of God. That is part of the extensionality of those statements. So whenever we're talking about an attribute of God, or whenever we're talking about the will of God, we are talking about God's being as much as we are talking about an aspect of that being. You can't separate the two. Unlike when I talk about the ears on a rabbit, the ears on the rabbit aren't the rabbit's being. It's just a component of the creature that I'm referencing. So when we talk about God choosing to create reality, he actually is, existentially speaking or ontologically speaking, he is the volition that is choosing. He's not a being who has a will, he is the will that's choosing. So the will itself is its own reason to create the world. I
don't see how that gets around any of the problems that we're bringing up, though. Maybe I'm not thinking into it. Would anybody else like to respond to that?
Oh, just to bring up something quickly in the side chat.
Sure.
Jimmy mentioned that God is not composed of parts, and somebody brought up the Trinity. The doctrinal understanding of the Trinity that's most often held is that the Trinity is not three parts of God. Each of the three persons of the Trinity is all of God.
One being.
But there are three distinct persons within being, right? But they're still three separate persons, right?
Not separate, distinct.
Right. What's
the difference? What's the difference between separate and distinct?
The difference is probably about 200 years of debate and theology.
Yeah, but a difference, that distinction is the same thing as talking of a rabbit with its ear. That ear is still the rabbit.
But we're saying that each of the three persons of God is all of God.
Right. So
and it's not really like the rabbit. The ear of the rabbit is not all of the rabbit. It is the ear of the rabbit.
No, but the composition of the rabbit is.
Yeah, but the thing is that if you cut the ears off of a rabbit, you still have a rabbit. But the ears by themselves are no longer a rabbit. You just now have an earless rabbit and a pair of ears.
Yeah, just to state this a little bit more simply, the doctrine of the Trinity has long been understood to be a divine mystery, and it's because what we tend to think colloquially as three parts of one being are explicitly defined as not parts. That's the doctrine of the Trinity says that it's not three things that compose or together constitute one being. It doesn't work that way. We shouldn't think the mereology here, the theory of how the parts relate to the whole, is different. With the Trinity is a mystery because it is unlike other things. It's not three parts that add up to one whole. It's not like the shamrock, the three lobes of the shamrock that make up the one shamrock and stuff like that. Theologians have long insisted that that is not the correct way to understand the Trinity. And whenever a Christian or a non-Christian characterizes the Trinity in terms of parts and a whole, they're in fact not describing the Trinity. They've actually stepped away from Trinitarian doctrine, and consequently, it's a mystery because we don't really have a good analogy for that. There's other. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just on this issue, and I know this is kind of a tangent. I would highly recommend the very amusing YouTube video called "St. Patrick's Bad Analogies" by the Lutherans.
It's a great one. It's brilliant.
very, very well done. It's an excellent video, and it discusses several of the potential analogies for the Trinity and why each of them is not considered accurate, but is considered a heresy.
Yeah, so I'll second that one.
So I'm going to pass it off to Skylar. You had a thought on the current part of the conversation that we're at right now.
Yeah. When we talk about the Trinity, and this is kind of a question I've been thinking about lately. In the Trinity, does each entity, like the God, Jesus, Holy Spirit, does it have three separate minds, or is it one mind? Is this what it would seem to because if we were to think of what separates, I guess we could think on a human level, or anything else, I guess anything living that we could think of, we would kind of we would decide something being separate basically by the mind in that sense, right? And if it's three separate minds that can think differently, well, let me not even go that far to say think differently, but let's just say three separate minds and go on that.
So what I would say is on some level, we know that they have separate minds, and what I mean by that is that the Bible does distinctly refer to the mind of Christ at one point and the mind of the Spirit at another point. So to the extent that we understand these are three persons, then to that extent they have separate minds. However, it says several times in the New Testament that they are one. That the Father and the Son are one, that the Father and the Spirit are one, okay, and what that means is that the idea then would be that although on some level they have separate minds, those minds are in complete harmony. In other words, they have the same nature, and therefore there can be no disagreement in those minds. Even as much as I've said may be saying more than we can really say, but that is my understanding.
So to pull this back to maybe the talk about the show itself is Skylar, one of the things that kind of came out in the last week's discussion with when we were talking about deism was one of the ideas is the idea of worship. That I know that Shanna expressed this idea that why would a god need worship? She said it was stupid. In your view of deism, do you hold a similar view? That a creator god, what would a creator god require anything from his creation?
I think the difference between we have two different complete views on deism. I view as God being the source, and that we are the source in some manner in the flesh, basically. So we aren't separate from the source. But I don't think of it in the idea that this being, this God, whatever you want to call it, I call it the source. I don't think it's separate from me. So I don't think it would require something of me like that. It would almost, by that nature, I would have to say that it isn't me, right? So when I think of the word worship, I guess I wouldn't think of it in a traditional way like that. I would think of it would be beneficial of me to try to understand the source better. Therefore, I could understand myself better.
Now, Jimmy, you brought up a point earlier where you thought that God's existence. I mean that God is existence. God is the essence. I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, so I apologize for that. But I mean, it sounds the same thing. If God is, why would it require anything from Him, from Himself? It's similar to a view that, I mean, you might call it slightly different ways, but the way that you describe it sounds kind of similar to how Skylar puts it out there.
Right. I think it might be confusing to phrase it in such a way God requires something of Himself. But again, I think that divine simplicity really solves this issue of why does God choose to create the world? Well, we already know He's not dependent on it. The reason why He chooses to create the world is because He chooses to create the world. And that's a perfectly valid response, because whenever you're talking about God's reasoning for things, ultimately all of His reasons are going to reduce to His desires and His choice to do so, because all of the things that are in creation come back to God's choice to create them, and God's choice to create them as of not being dependent on anything outside of Himself must find its explanation in Himself. But
see, I would hate to take that into a deeper realm of even asking, can God make choices? And even dig any deeper than the simplicity of that, because I think you set yourself up with a bunch of problems just saying just the simplicity version of what you just said.
Yeah, and you bring up the idea of desire and need again, and I don't think we've fully crossed that hurdle. But let's shift it up a little bit to creation. Let's to creation of man, for example. Is that does God want every single person to worship Him in your minds?
I would say God commands everyone to worship Him. And I think that God desires that everyone's existence glorify Him. But if by worship we're talking about a choice to worship God on our part, no, I do not think that God desires that in an effective way from everyone. Otherwise, everyone would worship Him.
See, the idea of glorifying God now, I mean, we've just kind of changed the wording up here again, is that, again, we're talking about a perfect being. Why would a perfect being even require glory? Why would it need anything to glorify Him?
Could I sort of point that question a little bit more?
Sure.
When we talk about people, in the world who want glory and people who want worship and respect and love and stuff like that, I mean, we understand why people want these things, right? We understand the kind of sort of base nature that we have, and we can understand why a tyrant, for instance, would want to be worshipped, feared, respected, praised, glorified, whatever. We can understand why an ordinary person, not necessarily a tyrant, could desire such things. And again, this comes to sort of as a causal consequence of the kinds of critters that we are. But why would a being that's perfect, that stands in need of nothing, want that? I mean, I know why, for instance, a tyrant wants to be praised, right? He's got a massive ego. And perhaps he needs to have it shorn up, and perhaps he hopes that if people are seen praising him, there will be no challengers to usurp his authority and power and stuff like that. So we understand why people in the world express a desire for worship, reverence, praise, glorification, and such. But why would a being that enjoys a satiety, that exists necessarily, and literally needs for nothing, and cannot be threatened by anything, cannot be harmed by anything, why does that being even want, never mind need, why does it even want praise and glory?
Well, let's take a couple of steps
much less
up.
demanded. Sure.
Let's take a couple of steps up. You can only think of reasons why a bad ruler would want respect, honor, and glory. You can't think of reasons a good ruler would.
No, I can.
Okay, so talk about those.
Okay, well,
why would a good and benevolent ruler, why would General George Washington, want to be respected, want to have people stand when he enters the room, and to be referred to as Mr. President and given respect? by ambassadors.
Sure, he'd want that because when that respect is bestowed upon him, it ratifies and reinforces his authority.
Right.
It conduces to the efficacy of him as a president,
Okay.
as opposed to him being treated with disrespect that would undermine his authority and legitimacy and interfere with his ability to implement his objectives and unify people and so forth. But I don't think that that's going to be a concern for a being that is perfect and all-powerful, for instance.
Well, I actually would say it would, because recognize that that as what the Bible says about the present age is that we're in the middle of a spiritual war, trying to restore people into communion with God, who have torn themselves away from God, and who are being pushed by dark forces to stay away from God. So, by the same reason that General George Washington, President Washington, would want proper respect, so that his ends are not thwarted, so that the things he's trying to accomplish with his authority can be accomplished. There's no reason that those same reasons don't apply to God.
I could challenge that. I mean, it seems to me that an omnipotent God is always able to bring about its objectives without that. I mean, an omnipotent God should be able to do. Well, shouldn't an omnipotent God be able to bring about the same objective without?
Well, yeah, an omnipotent God can bring out the same objective with a piece of chewing gum and a paperclip. That is
Right.
a facile argument, because
How so?
Because that doesn't negate why God would choose to do it this way. Okay, the fact that God, it is not a valid argument to say because there is some other means that God could use to this end, therefore him using this means to this end is not valid.
I think it does pose a problem, though, because
Why?
we return to the problem of arbitrariness. Your position seems to amount to God does it the way that he does it, right? But that's not an explanation. That doesn't answer the question why God demands it. Because the question is why does God want to demand it?
Hold on, because you're conflating a couple of things here. Okay. On the one hand, we're saying here is the objectives that are satisfied by God doing this, right? And that that was the original question. That's been answered now. But now you're saying, but wait a minute. You also have to create it in such a way that this is the only means he could use to complete that objective.
No.
That
It just seems
necessarily false for an omnipotent being, and so I find that counter argument to not have any merit.
Okay, it's not that there has to be only one way that it could be, but the question has to be answered: why does he want it this way?
Right, and let's get into that then. This is a good way to accomplish those ends. It's the same way that earthly authorities would use, and it has a number of other benefits, as I think has already been discussed. The main purpose of worship is to get us thinking about God, so that we will better align ourselves with God, so that we will better pursue a relationship with God and use God as a standard on our own lives. That is the purpose of it, and that is also consistent with this particular process to get it. What?
Sorry, my bad. I thought you were done. I have some.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to come back and address that in a second. I'm going to just pass this off to Skylar because I think he had a response to that, and then to Jimmy, and then if we hopefully haven't moved on too far, then I'm going to come back and address that as well.
Yeah, and I'll be quick. I might actually kind of know the response from kind of what I was hearing. I mean, there's just two quick solutions to this that would solve all these problems. One, God just revealed to everybody instantly in the way that would be that he knows that we would know 100% that he exists. And second, if there's really all these evil forces or this spiritual warfare going on, right? He would have the ability just to eliminate the evil spiritual stuff that's going on. And he could just do it. So those two simple things could eliminate all the problems almost instantly. And it always just seems like we're getting this it just seems like by definition, because we're defining God as always doing everything exactly the perfect way, and since this is the reality in which we're living, so this has to be the perfect way in which it was supposed to be done, like I said, I think Ozzy kind of hit the. It's not really an explanation so much. It's just we're defining it that way.
Can I?
Yeah.
Jimmy, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So again, I think again that when you ask why does God desire these things, well, He is His own desire. His choice to create the world is His existence. You cannot distinguish between the volition of God and the existence of God. So God exists in an eternal state of choosing to create this world. And so I don't find it to be I find the whole distinction between arbitrary and non-arbitrary to be problematic when we're talking about God, because God doesn't make decisions for any other reason other than Himself first. He first has to make all His decisions based on who He is and what He is and all the things that go into what it means to be God. And
Jimmy,
then once He, go ahead.
Sorry, no, please finish your point. I thought you were winding it up. I'm sorry.
I am. I was just going to say that once he defines reality as sort of having these internal explanatory factors, then we can reason about those. But for God, He's always working from the perspective of being in the state of choosing the thing itself. So I don't really see where the question comes in.
Okay, it sounds like you're sort of grounding all of this in the concept of divine nature, right? But then you're just saying, well, God does what He does, right? God just is the way He is, right? But then again, that leaves us sort of begging the question, well, why is God the way that He is, right? This isn't an account. This isn't an explanation, right? An appeal to something's nature is all by itself never an explanation, right? If I just say, if I do something and you say, well, Ozzy, why did you do that? And I say, oh, well, it's just in my nature to do that. I haven't explained anything, right? I've attributed to my nature a certain behavior that I have exhibited, but I haven't explained anything. And so our understanding of why God wants, desires, or demands worship or reverence or glorification is not answered by saying, well, that's just the way He is, right? That's the concern that I have about arbitrariness. Is if God were otherwise, that we would always be able to say, well, that's just the way God is. So that's why I think I find that answer intellectually dissatisfying for that reason.
Could I respond to that?
Oh, one second, sorry. I'll let you get back to it. I just want to get before we go too far off it, is because it kind of goes along with Skylar's point too, is that this answer of things are this way because God made it this way and therefore it must be perfect. It's not a satisfactory answer for me. I mean, if the need for God, if the desire for God is this worship, if that would be what God ultimately wants, is people to come to worship Him, omnipotent being would not be satisfied with the way it is now. It would be a world with one religion. With everybody worshiping Him, and I don't see how that we can. The fact that they're okay. Sorry, go ahead, Adam.
Well, no, somebody else wants to jump in.
Well, I was just going to say that I think that would be a good objection if that was God's only objective or only consideration. If God wanted, to be worshipped and there were no other mitigating concerns, then of course, yes, His will would be done and it would happen. There'd be one religion and everyone would be worshipped. Right? But
Both from
God has others.
Both from something Skylar said and this idea of everything, God could make it all one religion. Yes, absolutely. God could in 1 minute win the war. And at that moment, that would be the end of us. Particularly, it would be the end of our ability to make a free will choice to either do good or evil. The experiment would be over. The Bible says that the reason the war is not won is because God is patient. He wants more people to make the choice for Him. And all of these counterfactuals where God basically uses His power to force the issue. In all of those cases, it contradicts a world that we live in where moral decisions have real consequences, and God allows those consequences to abide in this world.
But if I had a better informed thought on this, right? So if he was to reveal himself in a way that he knows that I would 100% know that he exists and that he cares for me, right? If he was to do that, I would have a better informed decision, and I would be able to actually, I would still have choice because I could still make the choice on whether I want to worship him, whether I want to love him. But it would give me much more of a chance to actually get to heaven. And kind of like what you said, where you said, well, yeah, if he did it now, then all these people, would be lost, I guess, in a sense. That's not your exact words. Please forgive me if that's not exact. But that's by his choosing, because he created the consequences for these actions, because he was the one who set up the world exactly the way it is, and with what actions would have certain consequences, what's within our reality. So by definition, it would actually be his. That's the way he did it. So I feel like that almost contradicts that kind of
doesn't, though. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Jimmy, jump in, and then I think Sheamus wanted to add something as well.
Okay, thanks. I just want to respond to Ozzy, and I think this will implicitly respond to Skylar as well. I think the problem is, Ozzy, that your conception of the principle of sufficient reason here, which is what we're talking about when we're looking for explanatory power in something, they're different in their nature, but they're fundamentally different in the sense that I think that reality is basically dual. Reality has basically a semantic split, so that whenever you apply the principle of sufficient reason to God, it must apply in a way that is coherent to God's nature. You cannot apply the creature's principle of sufficient reason to the creator, and you cannot apply the creator's principle of sufficient reason to the creature. So if you're expecting the same kind of explanation from God that you would in any creaturely situation, then I would say the problem is that we've presupposed a principle of sufficient reason that has negated the possibility of the Christian God from the very outset. But I think that this is also the problem for Skylar. Is my position is that God has revealed himself to everyone and has made it perfectly clear that he exists, both through general revelation and through the special revelation of the Bible for those who have read it. And
Does
I think
it not open you up, Jimmy, to well, that's as an explanation for anything God does is, well, that just must be how it works in Godland.
Right, and so I would say I think that saying, Ozzy, it was in your nature to do this, I actually do think that that has some explanatory power. I don't think it has predictive power, but I think that it's very important not to conflate those two things. But what Ozzy is looking for is, I think, the kind of explanation that you would give for something that occurs in creation, and I think it's a categorical error to impose that kind of questioning on God. It simply doesn't work, because he's not that kind of being where you can look for some kind of explanation outside of this is the way he is. And I furthermore think that that's the biblical conception of God. The biblical conception of God is God exists, he exists the way he does and what he is, and his existence all to do without respect to anything beyond himself. He is what he is, and he doesn't need to turn to anything else to exist, to make choices, or to even distinguish himself as himself. So
Well, just to be real candid, that the explanation that things just work in Godland that way, kind of thing, or a mysterious way, or whatever, is a more viable answer for me than some of these other ones that do get contradicted or rebutted easily, or
it strikes me as misleading, though, to suggest that well, God is sui generis. God is in a category all by himself. Ex hypothesis, by hypothesis, by stipulation, God is in a category all by himself. Therefore, the principle of sufficient reason that we ordinarily apply doesn't apply there to God. We have to apply either some other principle, some different version of the principle of sufficient reason, or we have to abandon it. Now, as has been said in the side chat, neither Adam nor I subscribe to the principle of sufficient reason, but it seems to me that even if one does, the principle of sufficient reason is a principle, and it's supposed to be a universal principle, not a principle that applies to all things except God. I mean, to say that it doesn't apply in one case, such as God, is to say that there isn't a universal principle of sufficient reason. So it seems to me that one is trying to have one's cake and eat it too. This to me smacks of special pleading.
No,
I would agree.
Sorry,
I would say.
1 second, Adam. I'm going to let you give you a chance to respond. I know Sheamus has been waiting very patiently to probably respond to something that happened 5 minutes ago. So Sheamus, jump in, and then Adam, if you want to respond to what Sheamus says or what Ozzy says, feel free for it then.
Sure, it's kind of past, so I'll just be brief. And it's kind of all started from the fact that we've kind of established, or we have a consensus, at least among the theists in the room, that God doesn't really need anything, but he prefers worship, and we know that in the biblical sense it says, it's for His glory. Well, when the questions kind of pose, why is that? And Ozzy kind of said, well, it seems to be that they're saying that it just is. And I think after a certain point, epistemically within the justifications that we do have within the Bible, it basically becomes a tautology. It basically becomes, God desires what He desires. God prefers what He prefers. The breakdown of the reason, given our limited knowledge, is precisely that. Now, is that to say that God doesn't have His reasons? No. I also kind of wanted to liken this, just draw a quick analogy to kind of like people. Well, actually, I think it's probably not the best analogy, and I'll just cut it short there.
Okay, Adam, you wanted to? I'll let you respond to Ozzy now. Sorry about that.
There's a lot to say, but I'll just say the quick thing, which is I would agree. I don't think I line up with what Jimmy or Sheamus is saying on this. I like to try to speculate on real reasons. But on the point that saying God is something different is special pleading that Ozzy made. If it is, and perhaps it is, I can think of no situation where special pleading that would be more appropriate than in the case of trying to characterize the sort of being that is a God relative to the sort of being that we are.
Oh,
so if it's special pleading, it is probably the most justified case.
Yeah,
because if there's one thing the Bible teaches us on this subject, it's that God is fundamentally a different sort of creature than we are.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, it's like if you're a naturalist and you're trying to account for the origin of physical reality, whatever that cause is going to be is unlikely to be like anything in the universe, right? It's going to be sui generis. It's going to be, it's going to be quite exceptional. And similarly, if you're positing a God that stands outside of time and space and is a transcendental being, it's going to be sui generis. It's perfectly okay, but we just have to be careful there that when we're applying concepts like desires and wants and things like that, when we're applying these predicates that have an ordinary meaning when we're talking about people and critters and things like that, then we're applying them there to sort of explain and characterize that being. And then as soon as we encounter some kind of contradiction or paradox, we then say, oh, well, no, it's different in this case. Well, it just seems to me there that our explanation has broken down. And we just need to admit that there, at that point, the explanation breaks down, as opposed to insisting that, no, everything's fine, the explanation still holds. It seems to me that the explanation no longer holds. So, for instance, I think if God exists, he's not going to have physical causes, right? I think there are physical causes that operate on us. God, so conceived in Christianity, doesn't have physical causes acting on him. Okay, but presumably he's an intentional being, so he's a being of intentionalistic causation himself. Okay, but when we think of intentionalistic causation with respect to ourselves, we understand that those causes are themselves occasioned by things like needs, and in the case of a God, that's absent. So it seems to me that when we're talking about a being that's as remote as God from ordinary experience, we have to expect that the explanation is going to be weird and different. But at that point, we have to admit that when things get really weird and different and the paradoxes arise, we have to concede that the explanations are, in fact, unsatisfying. And I think that's what it might be missing here, is people are saying, well, no, everything's fine, everything's hunky-dory. But it seems to me these are not good accounts. These are not intellectually satisfying accounts, precisely because you're positing a being that is sui generis, that is in a class all by itself. And it ends up being special pleading because you're saying the account holds, except where it doesn't, in this case. And that I think is special pleading.
So one of the things that, sorry, I'm going to try to change pace a little bit here because we're running into our last half hour or so here, would be that the idea that with God being perfect, in the way that you guys describe perfection, and that everything that he does is the best possible action there, is that God can't do anything that's not perfect. God's creation is perfect. Are humans perfect? Because can God go and actually create something that's not perfect?
Can I answer that?
Sure.
I think that from the Christian point of view that I'm presenting here, I think that that's tautological. I think saying is God's actions perfect could be restated, are God's actions godly? Well, of course they're godly. They're God's actions. Basically, anything that God does, again, is himself. God is his choice. You can't separate the volition of God from his existence. So I think it's rather... I think the problem is that we get these ideas, for example, like maximal greatness, where we think there's some abstract concept outside of God by which to measure him as the greatest kind of some category. But I think that's absurd. Anytime you have these categories that we're talking about, the only metaphysical grounding for them on the Christian worldview is God himself.
What about Adam or Sheamus? Can God create something that's not perfect? And if he creates something that's not perfect, is that going out of his nature? Did he intentionally make something not perfect?
Well, I would say that perfect means complete, and by nature, anything other than God that God creates is not God, and therefore not in all ways complete. So the very act of creation is the act of God making something outside himself, which is lesser than himself, and therefore will be in some way not perfect.
I think another way you could rephrase this question too is if sin is the opposite of God's nature, right? It's completely opposed to him, and God can't be in the presence of sin. He can't be anything that's opposed to his nature. Then why create a world where something that would be possible, that would be opposed to his nature, would exist?
And my answer to that is that God's purpose for creating the universe, for creating our world, is to get at the end of the process souls that are in alignment of God by free moral choice. And it is not possible for that to occur in a universe without the capacity for harm and sin.
So by that, I'm sorry, one more thing. So by that definition, so are you saying God could not create a world where without that it would be possible?
That's what I'm saying, yes.
So there are things God could not do?
Yes, there are, absolutely. There are things that if God did them, it would be, I'll put it this way. Our universe has constraints. Anything that God did that didn't fall within those constraints would not be within this universe, and so I would call those things impossible. That doesn't necessarily limit the power of God. It just notes that if God did them, then our universe would be fundamentally different.
But the idea in Christian theology, what is that there is a world that God can create, or a reality that God can create free of harm and suffering. I mean, it's the afterlife.
Not one where there can be free moral choice to love Him. No. So
there's no free moral choice to love God in heaven.
Not heaven is an overly simplified. In the afterlife, the rules are somehow different. If in fact in the afterlife there's no capacity to do harm, then there's no moral choice either. Those two things are coincident.
So why would there be a need for the creation outside of creating a heaven? You'd have God would have all the worship and glory that He wants there.
Not from beings that chose to do it.
Well, do they have choice in heaven? I mean,
No, that would be, or if they have choice, it's not choice of the same kind.
So when you're saying heaven, are you talking about the Earth 2.0 thing, the
Yeah.
incorruptible
I
creation?
mean, one way to put it would be maybe in fact they do have choice, but these are individuals that are, since these are individuals that have been saved by God's grace and transformed, it's a choice that they that they will have already been proven to make. But the point is that in the absence of the ability to choose evil, there's no moral choice. In the absence of true moral choice, what God would not be getting out of the world what he in fact gets.
Then what would be the point in the ones for the vessels of destruction kind of thing? You know, what would be the point besides kindling for hell? What would be the point?
My understanding is essentially that they are they're essentially the other necessary part of the equation.
They're necessary for the good people.
They're rocket fuel.
They're necessary for the moral people to make moral decisions. Because
That's
without
right.
them,
They are rocket fuel. If you want your rocket to go in direction X, then a certain amount of fuel has to go in direction negative X.
Seems like what guides us, though, is what guides our choices is the consequences of it. You know, we avoid bad choices and choose good choices.
Right.
But if the non-believer doesn't see, you know, the result of our choices until it's too late, it seems like a bad way for this God to design things where we don't even see that we're making bad choices.
Now, I don't think that's ever the case. I think it is definitely my understanding that every person that is no longer in alignment with God makes that choice willingly and knowingly.
Can I?
I don't see how anyone would make a choice to be tortured eternally.
Oh, I'm not saying that they understand all the consequences necessarily of the choice, but the choice itself is something that they know they're making.
I mean, if my boss tells me, Floyd, you better get to work on time, or you're fired, I would believe him, and I would get to work on time because of the great consequences. If I believed the same of this God, that Floyd, you better repent and accept Jesus as your personal Savior, or you're going to be tortured forever. If I actually believed that, I would act on it. But since I don't act on it, I just don't think it's credible.
Yeah, Jimmy, I'm going to let you respond just 1 second. I'm just going to throw this out there, is that we got a couple spaces in the room right now, and we're getting into the last half hour now, or now we're in the last half hour. If you want to jump in and ask the panel a question regarding the topics that we're discussing, you can find the link under the YouTube video.
Or if you just want to be rudely insulted,
or if you just want to come in here and have Adam call you an idiot about everything that you say, that's fine too.
The Romans did not speak Roman; they spoke Latin.
I would love to talk about Floyd's analogy.
Yeah, not a problem. We're gonna get Jimmy going here next, and then Sheamus. Once Jimmy's done, feel free to jump in and throw something in.
Thanks. Really quick, I actually want to jump back real quick to the comment about God's being sui generis. And that is that, as I understand it, the fallacy of special pleading occurs where one imposes a certain standard. Right. So excuse me. Sui generis. The fallacy of special pleading occurs where one imposes a certain standard in their argumentation or against someone else, and then sort of does the double switch on them. Takes it out from under them, or takes it out from under themselves, so that they don't have to be as strict, or that somebody else suddenly has to be more strict than they have been. But I don't see where that occurred in my conversation, or at least my side of the conversation. I was explaining things in terms of a divine principle of sufficient reason, not in terms of the creaturely principle of sufficient reason. And I think when one tries to impose God under the creaturely form of the principle of sufficient reason, that is a category error. And I don't think that it's special pleading to point that out.
Well, the
But
principle of sufficient reason is supposed to be a universal principle.
I
Right.
don't think that there are such things.
Oh, okay, but that is the principle of sufficient reason. So it seems to me what you've done is you've said there's this little principle of sufficient reason, and there's this other principle of sufficient reason that applies only to God. And well, wait a minute, that you've just gotten rid of. I mean, the whole force of the principle of sufficient reason is that it is universally applicable. There is no limitation in its. There's no exception to the principle of sufficient reason.
The only
Okay, so
For everything there is a sufficient reason.
Right,
Um,
I apologize.
right,
I
yeah.
thought that when I said the specific sort of principle of sufficient reason, which I think is what I said when I brought it up, or when I tried to make the distinction between the various principles of sufficient reasons that we might be using. For example, you say you deny the principle of sufficient reason. I kind of suspect that you're more likely using a variation of it, as there have been very many different definitions of the principle of sufficient reason that have been posed.
The Leibnizian one is good for me.
Okay, I don't use Leibniz's, but suffice it to say, my interpretation would be when you have any kind of categorical rule, things always have to be split up between how they apply to God and how they apply to man, because they're totally different from my point of view.
Okay. Sheamus, you are incredibly patient, so feel free to jump in again. I appreciate you waiting.
Yeah, Floyd kind of drew an analogy about, why would God want these things a certain way, and he basically said that, God wants you to believe, basically, he says, well, if my boss told me that if I come in late, I'll be fired tomorrow, then, and I certainly believed, that was true, I wouldn't come in late tomorrow. So, but that's not to say that some people might think that when he says that he's not being honest about that. That he's just saying that, or he won't actually fire me. So I think the analogy is actually really, really congruent with kind of Christian theology, in the sense that your boss has told you that you will be fired tomorrow. Tomorrow hasn't come. Tomorrow's the analogy for the day of judgment, but he has told you will be fired tomorrow if you come in late. And
no, other people have told me he said that. Other people have told me that, and then there's pages written on it that have said that. He's never told me that. I think that was the point he was making, or the distinction he was making.
Yeah, but the distinction I'm making is he actually has told you that. And that's precisely what kind of the point I'm making. But yeah, anyways, it's not really worth talking about. But I just thought it was kind of.
One, I'm convinced. My boss exists. I recognize his authority. I worked in the workforce long enough to know, for poor performance or not following the rules, you get fired. But obviously, as a non-Christian, I have not learned that, right? In regards to Christian theology.
So I'm going to, I want to welcome Wolf King and Celtic King to the room here as well. Thanks for joining us. Celtic, first off, did you have anything that you want to ask the panel regarding the topic that we're discussing tonight?
I'd like to make it clear that I do not accept Celtic King's authority and will not bow to him.
Thank you. Celtic King, are you there? Or Celtic Kent, sorry, I'm confusing Wolf King and Celtic. Sorry, my bad.
Oh, well, I will accept Celtic Kent's authority then. That's fine.
Okay.
But not Wolf King's.
Wolf King. Okay, Wolf King, if you're there, would you like to add something to this or about the topic?
Yeah, just to respond to Adam, it's fine. So long as the cosmos knows Wolf King, that's fine enough. You're just like a small subject in it. But anyway, yeah, I think with direct experience, if you can verify it to other people, I think that has more to do with being more congruent with reality. If you're talking about something with personal experience and personal utility for yourself, I mean, you know, that's fine if you want to claim that for yourself. But if it's not, I mean, if you can't necessarily have the same experience, it's less likely to be congruent with reality. So that's my position on it.
Anybody want to respond?
Hey, I'll go back just to fill some dead air, just back to where I was being candid with that. That's what I'm saying over on the side with the special pleading argument. Is I understand that better, and I understand that it would be an irrationally held belief because there's no way I could ever justify a divine experience, and anything short of that, since it doesn't apply in God world, there would be no reason for me to ever go down that path of finding an evidence for God. So it destroys any other reason besides God showing himself to me for me believing in, which I have little issue with, just because we have an irrational side. Now, if I realized it was an irrational thing, and I would want to try to get rid of any irrational belief I had.
I think that when we ask questions about really these are theological questions. I think when we ask these questions, we have to come to the table with where we're getting our background knowledge from. And for me, this is mainly a biblical issue. I think that the answers that I'm trying to provide are something that you could more easily research in journals on theology than to listen to them from me. But I do my best here, and I think that when we're talking about God's relationship to creation, I think that the important thing to keep in mind is that the biblical idea of God is that he doesn't depend on anything beyond himself to be what he is, and neither does he depend on anything outside of himself to define what is beyond himself.
I think that's what circles us back around to the one of the questions Ozzy and I had earlier on was trying to ask if that's what if being fully fulfilled in every way was perfect. Is that what kind of God we're talking about here? What are some of these other definitions? Whenever we say God has a desire, does it apply to the same reasons that we have desires or wants? Do these words mean the same thing when you're talking about a God?
Well, and that's the thing. That's the idea that I'm bringing to the table. Is I don't think any word means, or I think very few words mean exactly the same thing when they're applied to God. I think that I think that there has to be some kind of distinction going on. For example, when we were talking about desires and needs, I think it would be perfectly reasonable to define God's desires apophatically, so that we're saying God has desires without needs. That's a perfectly simple and explanatory definition of God's choices being explained right there.
Apophatically, but that's negative. Like that means negative, right? I mean, so how does that work? How do you define God's wants or needs apophatically? Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So apophatic theology is theology that is focused on saying what God is by saying what He's not. Right. So, for example, if I say God's not a creature, although that doesn't necessarily explicitly affirm anything, I think it does implicitly.
God is no respecter of persons.
Right, but so how does an apophatic conception of divine wants or desires sort of resolve the concerns that we've raised here? I'm not sure how that works, or maybe I misunderstood you. Maybe that's not what you were saying.
No. I think you understood me, Ozzy. Yeah, I would say as far as the things on God's being arbitrary, I think divine simplicity solves that. As far as the question about desires being founded on needs, I would say you could get around that apophatically by just saying, well, God has desires without needs.
So, Celtic, I know you left and came back in. Did you sort out your mic problem, or did you have something that you wanted to ask the panel? Sorry, so I'm not getting any sound from you.
You're unmuted, but there's no sound coming from you.
I would like to point out that very shortly here it will be 9:26 p.m., which means we are exactly 12 hours from Pi time.
Pi.
March 14th, 2015, 9:26 will be 31415,926. So be ready for it.
Number files out there.
Also tomorrow is the wrap party for Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. If you have not been reading this masterpiece, you should go online and read it. It's available for free, and then you should find a wrap party in your area for other people who are celebrating the end of the story.
Okay, well, on that note, we're going to start bringing this to a close and let everybody go through and kind of throw out some last thoughts if they want here. So, Xbox, start with you. Do you have anything that you'd like to kind of close with or plug?
Yeah, no. I think I got everything out throughout there. My biggest, I actually agreed with Jimmy on a lot of it. I think it gets rid of other reasons that I hear. It gets rid of every other reason I hear for believing such a God would exist.
Could I make a quick comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah, I would actually agree with you on that, Xbox. I think that the creature-creator distinction obliterates pretty much all evidential arguments for the existence of God. Any argument which is not indirect in its nature, yeah, I think that the creator-creator distinction makes that impossible, because all those sort of arguments, what they're trying to do is say, here's this principle that we have that we can apply to God in the same way that we can apply to man. Well, no, you can't.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's I think the Bible clearly shows that too. I've pointed that out a few times over the past few months, and especially whenever people are going through the presuppositional arguments over evidential arguments, that pointed out that's when I actually saw the problem with evidential arguments. That I think the Bible actually shows that like I said, that the evidential arguments aren't good arguments to believe God, if that makes any sense. And I'm not trying to demean in any way of anyone's beliefs out there, but I think everything else we touched on we covered, or at least it got the broad points out there. Now we can dig in deeper into these points later on, which cool.
Okay, Skylar.
I don't really have any final thoughts. I think it was just fun time once again. I appreciate the good conversation, and I look forward to doing more of these hangouts.
All right, Sheamus. Sheamus might be AFK, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm still here. I just want to say thank you guys for having me, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, always a pleasure, man. Ozzy.
Yeah, I guess I'll just sort of reiterate a point I raised early on in the hangout, that when it comes to sort of understanding, why a God demands worship, it's hard to understand why he demands worship unless he wants worship. And to my mind, it's hard to understand wants without there being goals and purposes and intentions. And goals and purposes and intentions invariably are tied to needs. And if you have a being that is devoid of any needs, that is entirely self-sufficient, then I think that whole type of explanation starts to break down. Now, one could argue that, well, when we're talking about God, everything is sort of an argument from analogy. We can't really describe God in his essence and in his actual nature. So all of this is just sort of a way of speaking, right? We're sort of looking at how we do things, and this is just sort of a grand analogy. But to the extent that that analogy breaks down, I think the explanatory power of the account has broken down and is intellectually dissatisfying. So that's the concern that I have for this. So I'm still sort of left, wondering, why does God want and demand worship and glorification? It's perfectly clear to me why people would want such things, given the kinds of critters that we are. And the kinds of good reasons and bad reasons, the good goals and the commendable goals and the damnable goals that we have. but I don't know why an infinite being of effectively infinite power of omnipotence that has no needs at all would require anything like glorification or worship. And thank you for having me. It's fun.
Okay, Jimmy?
I don't think I can add anything more. Just thank you guys for the conversation. Really appreciated everyone's opinions being said, and yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. Floyd?
Yeah, I guess I can just offer kind of like a naturalistic explanation for why, many religions, have their deity require worship from their creation. I think it's just a matter of, I think it just creates loyalty. Just the way school kids say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning in school. I think it's the same sort of thing where it creates loyalty, it creates unity, and that promotes the common goal of strengthening the religion and having it grow and be maintained. So that's why I kind of think the whole idea of what worship is really about. So.
All right, and Adam, last word to you.
Thanks so much. It was a great conversation.
All right, cool. I just want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to thank everybody on the panel, especially Adam, Jimmy, and Sheamus. Without getting opposing views in here, it just becomes an echo chamber, and don't really want that here. So thank you guys for coming out. I know it was kind of last minute. And any time that we do one of these and I write down a series of questions, I only get through about half of them, or we cover most of them just, naturally, then generally it's a good night for us. So thank you, everybody for showing up, and thanks everybody for watching, and tune in next week. Talk to you guys later.